USAIN Bolt sees a humble grandpa struggling to pay for groceries, and what happened moved everyone. The golden Miami sunset cast long shadows across the parking lot as USAIN Bolt pulled his sleek SUV into an empty space at the neighborhood grocery store. He hadn't planned to stop here. His schedule was already packed with meetings and training sessions, but he desperately needed water and fresh fruit before heading back to his temporary residence. The Jamaican sprinter adjusted his cap and sunglasses, hoping for a quick, inconspicuous shopping trip. The automatic doors slid open, welcoming him with a rush of cool air conditioning mixed with the comforting scent of freshly baked bread. Despite his retirement from professional track, Bolt still moved with the easy grace of an athlete, his tall frame navigating the narrow aisles with natural fluidity. Here, among the simple shelves and everyday products, he felt a welcome respite from the constant spotlight that followed him around the world. Just water and fruit, he reminded himself, grabbing a small basket instead of a cart. He selected a bunch of bananas, some mangoes that reminded him of home, and bottled water. The store wasn't crowded, just a few evening shoppers picking up last-minute ingredients for dinner or tomorrow's lunch. As he approached the checkout area, Bolt noticed the short line moving slower than usual. At the front stood an elderly man, perhaps in his late 70s, with a slightly hunched back and trembling hands. The old man wore a faded blue button-up shirt, neatly tucked into khaki pants that had clearly seen better days. What caught Bolt's attention wasn't the man's appearance, but rather his evident distress. The elderly gentleman was carefully counting coins from a small leather pouch, his weathered fingers moving with deliberate concentration. On the counter lay a modest collection of items, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, some eggs, and what appeared to be medication boxes. The cashier, a young woman with a name tag reading Maria, waited patiently, though Bolt could see the growing line was causing her some anxiety. "I'm sorry," the old man said in heavily accented English, his voice barely audible over the store's background music. "I thought I had enough." He began removing items from his small pile, starting with the eggs. "Just the bread and medicine, please." Maria nodded sympathetically, but the customers behind him shifted impatiently. A businessman checked his watch repeatedly, while a woman with a toddler sighed audibly. The old man's shoulders hunched further, his embarrassment palpable as he continued counting his insufficient funds. Something twisted in Bolt's chest, a feeling he couldn't ignore. Throughout his career, he'd been blessed with success beyond his wildest dreams, fame that took him around the world, and fortune that secured his future. Yet here was a man struggling to afford basic necessities. Without thinking twice, Bolt stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his Jamaican accent distinctive even in those two words. The elderly man looked up, confusion etched across his deeply lined face. "Please, let me help." The old man blinked in surprise, not recognizing the famous athlete. Behind the sunglasses and cap, "No, he protested weakly. "I cannot accept. I insist," Bolt said firmly but gently, moving closer to the counter. "Everything he was going to purchase," he told Maria, "and my items too, please." The cashier's eyes widened slightly as she recognized him, but she maintained her professionalism. A hush fell over the small line of customers as they witnessed the interaction. Bolt placed his basket on the counter and pulled out his wallet. "Sir, really, it's my pleasure," he told the old man, who stood frozen in disbelief. "Everyone needs a hand sometimes." I don't know what to say," the elderly gentleman stammered, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you, young man. My name is Mateo Hernandez." "USAIN," he replied with a warm smile, deliberately omitting his last name, though he suspected recognition was dawning on Mateo's face. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Hernandez." As Maria rang up their combined purchases, the other customers watched in respectful silence. The businessman, who had been checking his watch, now looked slightly ashamed, while the mother with the toddler smiled approvingly. This wasn't about a celebrity making a grand gesture. It was simply one human being helping another, and that resonated with everyone present. When the total appeared on the screen, Bolt handed over his card without hesitation. The amount was insignificant to him, but he knew it meant everything to Matteo. As they waited for the receipt, the old man spoke softly. "I was a teacher for many years," he explained, his voice steadier now. "Mathematics, but the pension is not enough sometimes, especially with the medications." Bolt nodded, genuinely interested. "A teacher? That's one of the most important jobs there is." Matteo smiled, revealing missing teeth but also a dignity that transcended his current circumstances. "It was my calling. I loved every day in the classroom." As they collected their bags, Bolt noticed Matteo struggling with even the light weight of his groceries. The parking lot was dimly lit now, the Miami evening settling into darkness. "Mr. Hernandez, would you allow me to drive you home?" Bolt offered, concerned about the elderly man's journey. Matteo hesitated, then nodded gratefully. "If it's not too much trouble. I usually walk, but these old legs aren't what they used to be." As they walked toward his vehicle, Bolt felt an unexpected connection to this stranger, a man whose life had followed such a different path from his own. Something told him their chance meeting in this small grocery store might be more significant than either of them realized. The interior of Bolt's SUV was immaculate and comfortable, a stark contrast to the worn-down bus stops Matteo Hernandez had become accustomed to. As the elderly man settled into the passenger seat, his grocery bags carefully placed in the back, he looked around with undisguised admiration. "This is a very nice car," Matteo commented, his hands folded neatly in his lap, almost afraid to touch anything. "You must be very successful in your work." Bolt smiled as he started the engine. "I've been fortunate," he replied simply, not wanting to emphasize the vast gulf between their financial situations. "Which way should I go, Mr. Hernandez?" "Please, call me Matteo," the old man insisted, pointing toward the east. 7 blocks that way, then right on Palmetto Street. It's the small yellow house with the white fence. Well, what's left of it," he added with a self-conscious chuckle. As they pulled out of the parking lot, a small crowd had gathered near the entrance of the grocery store. Maria, the cashier, was animatedly telling her co-workers about what had just happened inside. A few people had their phones out, though Bolt was used to this and paid it no mind. His focus was entirely on the elderly gentleman beside him and ensuring he got home safely. "You mentioned you were a mathematics teacher," Bolt said, genuinely curious. "How long did you teach?" Matteo's face brightened immediately, years seeming to fall away from his weathered features. 42 years, young man. I started when I was just 23, fresh from university in Cuba. When we came to America, I had to begin again, learn the language, get new certifications. But mathematics is a universal language, isn't it? I was never very good at math," Bolt admitted with a laugh. "My talents were elsewhere." "Every person has their gift," Matteo replied wisely. "Mine was helping children see the beauty in numbers. You know, many students fear mathematics because it is taught without joy, without connection to their lives." As they stopped at a red light, Bolt glanced at the old man. There was something captivating about him, a quiet dignity and intelligence that shone through despite his humble circumstances. Matteo's hands, though trembling slightly with age, gestured expressively as he spoke about his former profession. "I developed my own methods over the years," he continued, eyes twinkling with pride. "Ways to make algebra, geometry, even calculus accessible to young minds. The school administrators, they didn't always approve of my unorthodox techniques, but the results spoke for themselves." The light changed, and Bolt accelerated gently. That sounds amazing. Did you ever publish your methods? A shadow crossed Matteo's face. No. Many times I tried, but without academic credentials from an American university, publishers weren't interested. Later, when I had established myself, there was never enough time. Always more students needing help, more papers to grade. He sighed. And now, who would listen to an old man whose hands shake too much to even count coins properly? The self-deprecating comment struck Bolt deeply. Here was someone who had devoted his life to educating generations of children, reduced to embarrassment in a grocery store checkout line. The injustice of it stirred something within him. Turn here? Bolt asked as they approached Palmetto Street. Yes, and it's the third house on the right, Matteo confirmed. The yellow one. Bolt pulled up in front of a small, modest home. The paint was indeed yellow, though faded and peeling in places. The white picket fence Matteo had mentioned was incomplete, with several sections missing entirely. The small front yard, however, was immaculately maintained, with neatly trimmed grass and a few carefully tended flowering bushes. Would you like to come in for coffee? Matteo offered as Bolt helped him with the grocery bags. It's not much, but I make a decent Cuban coffee. My Teresa, God rest her soul. She always said my coffee was the one thing that made her marry me. He laughed softly at the memory. Bolt checked his watch, His schedule was tight, but something told him this was important. I'd like that very much, thank you. Inside, the house was small, but meticulously clean and organized. What struck Bolt immediately were the bookshelves. They lined nearly every wall, packed with volumes on mathematics, education, history, and literature. Framed photographs covered the remaining wall space, most showing Matteo with different groups of students throughout the decades. In one corner stood a small desk, its surface covered with papers filled with equations and diagrams. Please, sit. Matteo gestured to a worn but comfortable-looking armchair while he shuffled to the kitchenette. The coffee will take just a moment. As Matteo busied himself with the coffee preparation, Bolt's attention was drawn to a stack of notebooks on the side table next to his chair. The top one was open, revealing pages of colorful diagrams, innovative visual representations of mathematical concepts. Even to Bolt, who had struggled with math in school, these illustrations made complex ideas seem accessible and almost intuitive. Did Takatuan, you create these? He called to Matteo, carefully turning the pages with genuine interest. Matteo glanced over his shoulder and nodded. My life's work in many ways. I found that students who struggled with traditional methods often excelled when concepts were presented visually, with real-world applications. He returned with 2 small cups of strong coffee. These are from my last years of teaching, though I still add to them. Old habits, you know. As Bolt sipped the strong, sweet coffee, Matteo had been modest, it was excellent. He continued to look through the notebook with growing amazement. These weren't just teaching aids. They represented a comprehensive, innovative approach to mathematics education. Matteo, these are incredible, he said sincerely. Have you shown these to anyone recently? Publishers, education departments? The old man shook his head sadly. Who would be interested in an old man's scribblings? The world has moved on to computers, to online learning. My methods are perhaps too old-fashioned. Bolt thought of the millions of children worldwide who struggled with mathematics, whose potential was limited by fear of a subject that could be made accessible through approaches like Matteo's. He thought of his own platform, his connections, his resources, and a plan began to form in his mind. Mr. Hernandez, he said, setting down his coffee cup, would you mind if I took some photos of these pages? I have a friend who works in education, publishing, who might be very interested. Matteo looked genuinely surprised. You would do that for me? But why? You've already been so kind. Bolt smiled warmly. Because real talent deserves recognition, no matter when it's discovered. He held up the notebook. And this is real talent. As Bolt took photos of the most innovative pages, Mateo told him more about his life, his escape from Cuba in the 1960s, meeting his beloved Teresa, who had passed away 5 years ago, their struggles and triumphs in building a life in America. Throughout it all, teaching had been his constant, his purpose. When it was time to leave, Bolt helped put away the groceries before saying goodbye. At the door, Mateo took his hand in both of his weathered ones. "I don't know why fate brought you to that grocery store tonight," the old teacher said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I thank God it did. Not for the groceries, though I am grateful, but because for the first time in many years, someone has made me feel that my life's work might still have value." "It has more value than you know," Bolt assured him. "And this isn't goodbye, Mr. Hernandez. I'll be in touch very soon." As he drove away, Bolt was already making plans. What had begun as a simple act of kindness in a grocery store checkout line had revealed something much more significant, a lifetime of educational innovation at risk of being lost forever. The world's fastest man was now on a different kind of mission, one that might change countless lives, starting with an elderly mathematics teacher who had almost given up hope. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Bolt's Miami rental as he sat reviewing the photos he'd taken of Mateo's notebooks. With each page he examined, his conviction grew stronger. These methods were revolutionary in their simplicity and visual approach. Even he, who had always considered himself not a math person, could understand concepts that had eluded him in school. Bolt reached for his phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Marcus? It's USAIN. Remember that educational foundation we discussed last year? I think I found the perfect first project." Marcus Williams was a former Olympic sprinter who had transitioned into educational philanthropy, focusing on underserved communities. He and Bolt had often discussed collaborating, but until now, they hadn't found the right initiative. "I'm listening," Marcus replied, curiosity evident in his voice. For the next 20 minutes, Bolt described his encounter with Mateo and the treasure trove of educational materials he'd discovered. He sent several photos of the notebooks to Marcus while they talked. "This is remarkable," Marcus said after reviewing the images. "These visual approaches could help thousands of students who struggle with traditional teaching methods. What are you thinking?" "I want to help Mateo publish his work, but that's just the beginning," Bolt explained, his excitement building. "I'm envisioning a pilot program in local schools, using his methods as supplementary material, especially in underperforming districts." By the end of the call, they had the outlines of a plan. Marcus would arrange a meeting with education specialists to evaluate Mateo's methods, while Bolt would speak with his contacts in the publishing world. But first, he needed to talk to Mateo again, this time with a proposal that might change everything. That afternoon, Bolt returned to the little yellow house with the broken white fence. He carried with him a professional-looking portfolio case and a small bag from a local bakery. When Mateo opened the door, surprise and delight crossed his face. "Mr. Bolt, I didn't expect to see you again so soon," he exclaimed, ushering him inside. "Please, come in." "I brought pastelitos," Bolt said, offering the bakery bag. "The woman at the shop said these were traditional Cuban pastries. I hope you like them." Mateo's eyes misted over. "Teresa used to make these every Sunday. Please, sit while I make coffee." Once they were settled with coffee and pastries, Bolt opened the portfolio case. "Mr. Hernandez, I showed your work to some colleagues in education," he began. "They were extremely impressed, especially with your visual approach to algebra and calculus." Mateo looked genuinely surprised. "Truly?" "Absolutely. In fact, we'd like to propose something to you," Bolt continued, laying out printed agreements. We want to help you publish your methods as a comprehensive curriculum supplement. It would be called the Hernandez method, and you would retain full creative control and ownership. Mateo's hands trembled as he reached for the papers. I don't understand. Why would anyone be interested in my old notebooks? Because your approach solves problems that modern education still struggles with, Bolt explained earnestly. Mathematics education hasn't fundamentally changed in decades, yet failure rates remain high. Your visual methods could help countless students who, like me, never connected with traditional teaching styles. For the next hour, they discussed the details. The initial plan would involve professional digitization of Mateo's notebooks, followed by testing and select Miami schools as supplementary material. If successful, they would expand to a published curriculum that could be adopted nationwide. As Mateo processed the information, he looked around his modest living room, filled with books and memories of a teaching career that had seemed to end in obscurity. "May I show you something?" he asked suddenly, standing with more energy than Bolt had seen from him before. He disappeared into another room and returned with a worn leather satchel. From it, he carefully extracted a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. "These are from my former students," Mateo explained, handling them with reverence. "Over 40 years of teaching, I kept every note, every letter." He selected one and handed it to Bolt. "This one came just last year." The letter was from a woman named Elena Rodriguez, now a professor of astrophysics at MIT. She wrote about how Mateo's unconventional teaching methods had transformed her relationship with mathematics when she was a struggling immigrant student, ultimately leading her to a career in science. "There are hundreds like this," Mateo said softly. "Engineers, doctors, scientists, all of whom once thought they couldn't understand mathematics. These letters are my greatest treasure." Bolt understood then what this project truly meant. It wasn't just about publishing methods or creating a curriculum. It was about honoring a lifetime of dedication and extending Mateo's impact to a new generation. "Will you do it?" Bolt asked. "Will you partner with us to share your methods with the world?" Mateo looked at the letters in his lap, then at the agreements on the table. A lifetime of quiet innovation was being offered a global stage. Slowly, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice firm despite his age. "For all the students who still believe they cannot understand mathematics, for them, I will do it." They spent the remainder of the afternoon diving deeper into Mateo's methods. The elderly teacher came alive as he explained his techniques, demonstrating with examples how he taught concepts like quadratic equations using visual models that connected to real-world situations. His passion was infectious, and Bolt found himself understanding mathematical relationships that had mystified him in school. As evening approached, Mateo shared more of his personal journey, his childhood in pre-revolutionary Cuba, his early struggles as an immigrant teacher in America, and his unwavering belief that every child could master mathematics with the right approach. "My colleagues often criticized my methods," Mateo confessed. "They said I was wasting time with colorful diagrams when students should be memorizing formulas, but I saw how students' eyes would light up when they finally understood a concept. That moment of illumination, that is worth everything." When it was time to leave, Bolt promised to return in a few days with the education specialists. As he walked to his car, he noticed something he had missed before. A small sign beside Mateo's front door, faded but still legible. "A teacher affects eternity. He can never tell where his influence stops." How true that was, Bolt thought. And if their plan succeeded, Mateo Hernandez's influence might extend far beyond what either of them could imagine. 3 months passed in a whirlwind of activity. What had begun as a chance encounter in a grocery store had evolved into a full-fledged educational initiative. The Hernandez method, as it was now officially called, was being piloted in 5 Miami public schools. Focusing on students who had historically struggled with mathematics, Bolt stood at the back of a classroom at Lincoln Memorial Middle School in Liberty City, one of Miami's most underserved neighborhoods. The school had consistently ranked among the lowest in the state for mathematics proficiency. Now, 30 students were engaged in a lesson using Mateo's visual approach to algebraic equations, led by Ms. Rivera, a young teacher who had enthusiastically embraced the new methods. "Remember," Ms. Rivera was saying, "the variable isn't just a letter, it's a container holding an unknown value." She demonstrated with actual boxes and colored counters on the students' desks, a direct application of Mateo's tactile learning techniques. What struck Bolt most was the level of engagement. These were the same students who, according to the principal, had previously shown little interest in mathematics. Now they were actively participating, calling out answers and helping each other understand the concepts. Beside him, Mateo watched with tears in his eyes. The past months had transformed him. Though still physically frail, he stood straighter now, his voice stronger when he spoke. Weekly meetings with curriculum developers and education specialists had given him a renewed sense of purpose. His small home had become the unofficial headquarters of the project, with his living room now filled with professional equipment for digitizing his notebooks and recording his explanations of various techniques. "It's working," Mateo whispered, watching a young girl successfully solve an equation that would have been considered well beyond her grade level under traditional teaching methods. They truly understand. The pilot program had faced initial skepticism from school administrators and some parents. Why change methods when standardized tests were based on traditional approaches? But when the first month's results showed significant improvement in student performance and engagement, skepticism had given way to cautious optimism. Marcus Williams had been instrumental in securing funding and institutional support. His educational foundation had provided grants for materials and teacher training, while Bolt had leveraged his celebrity status to generate media interest and corporate sponsorships. A major publishing company had already signed an agreement to produce a comprehensive curriculum based on the Hernandez method, with a generous royalty arrangement for Mateo. As the class ended, several students approached Mateo, asking him questions about the lesson and showing him their work. The elderly teacher beamed as he reviewed their notebooks, offering gentle corrections and words of encouragement. These informal interactions had become a regular occurrence. Students who had previously avoided mathematics class now sought out Mr. H for additional guidance. "You've created something extraordinary here," said Principal Larson, joining Bolt by the doorway. "Our math proficiency scores are projected to improve by at least 30% this year. The school board is already asking about expanding to other schools in the district." "It's all Mateo," Bolt replied, watching the former teacher interact with the students. "We just provided the platform." Later that afternoon, Bolt and Mateo sat in a conference room at the school district headquarters, presenting the preliminary results to the superintendent and a group of education officials. The data was compelling: improved test scores, increased attendance in math classes, and, perhaps most significantly, higher self-reported confidence in mathematical ability among students. "What makes this approach different," Mateo explained, his voice steady and professional, "is that it meets students where they are. Traditional mathematics education often fails because it presents concepts abstractly, without connection to students' lived experiences. The Hernandez method bridges that gap. The presentation was a success. By the end of the meeting, the superintendent had approved expansion to 15 additional schools for the following semester, with a commitment to comprehensive teacher training. As they left the building, a local news crew was waiting. Word had spread about the innovative program that was transforming mathematics education in Miami's most challenged schools. "Mr. Bolt, Mr. Hernandez," called the reporter. "Can you tell us how this unusual partnership came about?" Bolt looked at Mateo, who nodded slightly, giving permission to share their story. "We met by chance," Bolt explained, "in a grocery store checkout line. Mr. Hernandez was having trouble paying for his groceries and I offered to help. What I didn't know then was that I was helping a brilliant educator whose methods would soon be helping thousands of students." The story aired on local news that evening, and by morning it had been picked up by national outlets. The narrative was compelling. A chance encounter between a sports celebrity and an elderly teacher leading to an educational revolution. Social media exploded with the hashtag #YesHernandezMethod, and inquiries began pouring in from schools across the country. What touched people most wasn't just the educational innovation, but the human story behind it, the recognition of value. In someone society had largely forgotten, the restoration of dignity to a man who had given his life to teaching others. It resonated in a world that often seemed to prioritize flash over substance, youth over experience. For Mateo, the validation was profound. After decades of having his methods questioned or dismissed by administrators, his approach was now being recognized as groundbreaking. More importantly, it was helping children who had believed themselves incapable of succeeding in mathematics. One evening, as they left a teacher training session, Mateo turned to Bolt with an expression of wonder. "Do you know what one of my students said today?" he asked. "She said, 'Math used to be my worst subject. Now it's the class I look forward to most.' In all my years of teaching, that is the greatest reward, seeing a child discover joy in learning." Bolt smiled, thinking about how far they had come from that grocery store checkout line. "And we're just getting started." Indeed they were. Requests for information about the Hernandez method were coming in from school districts across the country. Educational researchers were beginning formal studies on its effectiveness. The publishing deal was moving forward, with the first comprehensive curriculum guide scheduled for release in the coming months. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had sparked something much larger, a movement to transform how mathematics was taught, making it accessible to all students regardless of background or learning style. And at the center of it all was an elderly teacher who had almost given up hope that his life's work would ever make a difference beyond the walls of his own classroom. As they drove back to Mateo's house, now easily recognizable in the neighborhood, with its freshly painted yellow exterior and restored white fence, Bolt reflected on how seemingly small actions could lead to profound changes. One moment of compassion in a grocery store had not only changed Mateo's life, but would potentially change the educational experiences of countless students for generations to come. That, he thought, was the true meaning of legacy. The auditorium of the National Teachers Conference in Washington, D.C. was filled to capacity. Educators from across the country had gathered for the keynote presentation, The Hernandez Method, Reimagining Mathematics Education for the 21st Century. At the center of the stage stood Mateo Hernandez, now 80 years old but standing tall, his voice clear and confident as he addressed the audience of thousands. "For too long," he was saying, "we have accepted that mathematics is inherently difficult, that only certain minds can truly master it. This is a fundamental misconception. Mathematics is not just accessible to all, it is the birthright of every human mind. The challenge has never been the subject itself, but how we present it." It had been 2 years since that fateful evening in the Miami grocery store. In that time, the Hernandez method had grown from a local initiative to a national movement. Over 300 schools across the country had adopted the curriculum, with results that consistently showed dramatic improvements in student performance and engagement. The comprehensive curriculum guide, Visual Pathways to Mathematical Understanding, had become a bestseller in educational publishing. Translated into 12 languages, it was now being implemented in schools around the world. Mateo's colorful diagrams and intuitive explanations had transformed classrooms from Miami to Manila, creating new generations of students who approached mathematics not with dread, but with confidence and curiosity. Sitting in the front row, USAIN Bolt watched with pride as Mateo demonstrated a technique for teaching complex fractions using overlapping circular diagrams projected on the screen behind him. The elderly teacher moved with energy that belied his age, his passion for education undiminished after more than 5 decades in the classroom. What few in the audience knew was how close this wisdom had come to being lost forever. An elderly man struggling to pay for groceries, his innovative methods confined to notebooks in a modest Miami home. The thought still gave Bolt chills. After the presentation, as educators lined up to speak with Mateo and get signed copies of his book, Bolt slipped backstage to prepare for the afternoon's special announcement. The Bolt Hernandez Foundation, established 18 months earlier, was about to launch its most ambitious initiative yet, a national scholarship program for students from underserved communities pursuing careers in mathematics education. The foundation had already accomplished much, renovating mathematics classrooms in low-income schools, providing specialized training for teachers, and developing digital resources based on the Hernandez method. But this new program represented a vision for long-term, systemic change, creating a new generation of teachers trained in more accessible, intuitive approaches to mathematics. When Mateo joined him backstage, the elderly teacher was beaming but exhausted from the morning's activities. "Are you ready for the announcement?" Bolt asked, concerned about his friend's energy levels. Mateo straightened his tie and smiled. "More ready than I've ever been. This is the culmination of everything we've worked for, ensuring the methods continue beyond both of us." They returned to the stage together, where Bolt addressed the audience about the new scholarship initiative. As he spoke, he noticed educators throughout the auditorium nodding in approval, many taking notes or recording the presentation on their phones. "Education should not be a privilege of the few, but a right for all," Bolt concluded. "With the Hernandez-Bolt Scholarship, we aim to ensure that innovative teaching approaches reach every classroom in America, regardless of zip code or socio-economic status." The announcement was met with a standing ovation. Afterward, as they made their way through the conference center, they were approached by a middle-aged woman in a formal business suit. "Mr. Hernandez, Mr. Bolt," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Chen, Deputy Secretary of Education. The department has been following your work with great interest, and we'd like to discuss incorporating elements of the Hernandez method into federal education guidelines." This was more than they had dared hope for. Potential national policy impact that could affect millions of students. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, adding another dimension to their already transformative work. That evening, they celebrated with a small dinner attended by key foundation staff and early adopters of the Hernandez method. As dessert was served, Mateo stood to offer a toast. "2 years ago," he began, his voice slightly tremulous with emotion, "I was an old man counting coins in a grocery store, wondering if my life's work had meant anything at all. Today, I have seen my methods help children across this nation discover their own mathematical abilities." He raised his glass. "To unexpected meetings and second chances, and to Usain Bolt, who saw value where others saw only an inconvenience in the checkout line." The gathering responded warmly, but Bolt felt uncharacteristically humble. Yes, he had recognized Mateo's potential and provided resources to develop it, but the true gift had been Mateo's lifetime of innovation and dedication. All Bolt had done was remove the barriers that had kept that gift from reaching a wider audience. Later that week, they visited Lincoln Memorial Middle School in Miami, where their journey had begun. The school had been transformed, not just physically, with its newly renovated mathematics classrooms, but in spirit. Where mathematics had once been the most dreaded subject, it was now among the most popular. In one classroom, they observed a lesson taught by Ms. Rivera, who had been among the first teachers trained in the Hernandez method. On the wall behind her hung a framed copy of Mateo's original notebook page illustrating quadratic equations, a reminder of the method's humble origins. "The beautiful thing," Ms. Rivera told them after class, "is how it's spread beyond mathematics. Students are applying these visual learning techniques to other subjects, and the confidence they've gained that transfers to everything they do." Indeed, the school's improvements extended far beyond mathematics scores. Attendance rates had improved, disciplinary incidents had decreased, and more students were enrolling in advanced courses across all subjects. The ripple effects of mathematical confidence were transforming the entire educational experience. On their final day in Washington, before returning to Miami, Bolt and Mateo visited the National Museum of American History, where a special exhibition on educational innovation had recently opened. There, in a glass case in the center of the exhibition, was Mateo's original notebook, the one Bolt had first seen in the modest yellow house 2 years earlier. The placard beside it read, "The Hernandez Method, a visual approach to mathematics that transformed American education." Mateo stood silently before the display, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Bolt placed a hand on his shoulder, understanding the profound emotion of the moment. "I never thought," Mateo began, then had to pause to compose himself. "I never thought my work would be remembered this way. It will be remembered long after both of us are gone," Bolt assured him. "That's what a true legacy is." As they left the museum, stepping into the bright Washington sunshine, Mateo turned to Bolt with an expression of deep contentment. "You know what I think about sometimes?" he asked. "That day in the grocery store. How close we came to never meeting if you had been 5 minutes later, or I had chosen a different store, or if you had simply walked past like everyone else." "But I didn't," Bolt said simply, "and you didn't give up on your methods, even when the world seemed uninterested." "There's a lesson in that, isn't there?" Mateo mused. "Sometimes the most important connections in life hang by the thinnest threads. One small act of kindness can change everything." The following autumn, the first class of Hernandez Bolt scholars began their teacher training programs at universities across the country. 25 passionate young people from diverse backgrounds, all committed to revolutionizing mathematics education in their communities. The scholarship covered not only their tuition and expenses, but included mentorship from master teachers. Trained in the Hernandez method, Mateo had insisted on meeting each scholar personally, sharing his insights and encouraging their innovations. "Don't just follow my method," he told them during their orientation retreat in Miami. "Improve upon it. Find new ways to make mathematics accessible to every kind of learner." By this time, Mateo's modest yellow house had been transformed. While still humble compared to the homes of most educational innovators of his stature, it now had a proper office where he continued to develop new teaching materials. The broken white fence had been replaced, and the garden expanded with the help of neighborhood children who had become regular visitors, seeking both mathematical guidance and the wisdom that only comes with 8 decades of life experience. The once empty refrigerator that had necessitated the fateful grocery trip was now consistently stocked, though Mateo insisted on maintaining his frugal lifestyle despite the comfortable royalties from his books and curriculum materials. Most of his earnings went directly into a foundation to support mathematics education in underserved communities. One crisp December morning, Bolt received a phone call from Marcus Williams. "Have you seen the news?" Marcus asked, excitement evident in his voice. The National Education Association just released their annual report on educational innovations. The Hernandez method was named the most significant advancement in mathematics education in the past decade. Bolt immediately called Mateo to share the news, but there was no answer. Concerned, he drove to the Yellow House, only to find it empty. A note on the kitchen table directed him to the local community center. There, in a room filled with children of all ages, sat Mateo Hernandez. Not presenting at a prestigious conference or consulting with education officials, but doing what he loved most, teaching. With colored markers and simple visual aids, he was helping a group of neighborhood children understand the principles of calculus. Children as young as 10, grasping concepts usually reserved for advanced high school or college students. Bolt stood in the doorway, watching silently, not wanting to interrupt. Mateo spotted him, but continued the lesson, his eyes twinkling with the joy of a man doing exactly what he was born to do. When the session ended and the children had departed with newfound mathematical confidence, Mateo approached Bolt with a smile. "I heard the news," he said before Bolt could speak. "It's a wonderful recognition." "You didn't answer your phone," Bolt replied. "I was worried." Mateo gestured to the room around them. "This is where the real work happens. Not in Washington or in publishing offices, but here, with children discovering that they can understand what they thought was beyond them." He gathered his teaching materials slowly. All the recognition in the world means nothing compared to the moment when a child who believed they couldn't understand mathematics suddenly says, "Oh, I see it now." As they walked back to Mateo's house together, they passed the grocery store, where they had first met nearly 3 years earlier. By unspoken agreement, they paused outside. "Should we go in?" Bolt suggested. "For old time's sake?" Inside, the store had barely changed. The same checkout counters, the same aisles of products. Maria, the cashier who had witnessed their first interaction, was no longer there. She had used the publicity from their story to secure a scholarship of her own and was now studying education at the University of Miami. They filled a small basket with items, bread, milk, fruit, and approached the checkout. The young man at the register didn't recognize them, efficiently scanning their purchases without comment. When it came time to pay, Bolt reached for his wallet, but Mateo gently stopped him. "Allow me, my friend," the elderly teacher said, producing his own wallet. "This time, it's my turn." As they left the store, grocery bags in hand, Mateo looked thoughtfully at Bolt. "You know, when I was younger, I used to believe that great changes required grand gestures, revolutions, movements, dramatic upheavals. Now I understand that the most profound transformations often begin with the smallest acts of human connection." Bolt nodded in agreement. Their work together had impacted thousands of lives, transformed educational approaches nationally, and created pathways for future innovation. Yet it had all begun with one simple moment of compassion in a grocery store checkout line. A moment when the world's fastest man had paused long enough to see the value in an elderly stranger struggling to pay for basic necessities. The Hernandez method will continue to evolve long after both of us are gone, Bolt reflected as they walked through the Miami streets. "But I hope people remember how it started. With kindness," Mateo said simply, "the most powerful force in human experience." As the sun began to set over Miami, casting golden light across the cityscape, the unlikely friends, the aging mathematics teacher, and the world-class athlete continued their walk in comfortable silence, each contemplating the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. A journey that reminded all who heard their story that sometimes the most important legacy is not what you achieve for yourself, but what you make possible for others. And it had all begun with a simple choice: to see the dignity in a stranger and offer help without expectation of return. In a world that often measured value in fame, wealth, or power, this was perhaps the most revolutionary lesson of all, that a single act of kindness could spark changes that would echo through generations.